We're going to go ahead and dive in because we got a lot of ground to cover today. If you haven't been here, we've been walking through a book called The Gospel According to the Jesus Seminar. And in this book, what they've done is they've isolated the text that scholars and historians are fairly certain that the early church upheld, and they're also pretty sure that Jesus probably mentioned something like this. When you hear atheists and agnostics criticizing Christianity because of later additions and inconsistencies in the text, they're actually right. But what this book has done is brilliant. It's taken all five Gospels, the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Gospel of Thomas, which should have been canonized, and it's compiled all the verses that scholars and historians are sure that the early church projected in their circle of influence. So we're going to dive right in with the next passage here. It says this: "Once there was a judge in this town who neither feared God nor had any respect for people." Sound familiar? "In that same town was a widow who kept coming to him and demanding, 'Give me a ruling against my opponent.' For a while he refused. But eventually he said to himself, 'I don't really fear God, and I have no respect for people. But this widow keeps pestering me, so I'm going to rule in her favor, or else she's going to keep coming back until she wears me down.'" Keeps going. "A greedy man owned a vineyard and rented it to some farmers so they could work it and he could collect its crop from them. He sent his slave so the farmers would give him the vineyard's crop. They grabbed him, beat him, and killed him. And the slave almost killed him, And the slave returned and told his master. His master said perhaps he didn't know them. So he sent another slave, and the farmers beat that one as well. Then the master sent his son and said, perhaps they'll show my son some respect, because the farmer knew that he was the heir to the vineyard. They grabbed him and killed him. The farmer's empire is like someone who wanted to kill a strong man. The father's empire is like someone who wanted to kill a strong man. While still at home, he drew his sword and thrust it into the wall to find out whether his hand would be strong enough. Then he killed the strong man." All right, so this is a lot of brutality this week, but I want you to talk about your observations in these texts. It's a very interesting group of texts that we have this week. So talk about what you see, and then we're going to come back in just a brief moment and share with each other what our observations are about this week's text. Does anyone want to share what they talked about within their groups? Yes.
We were kind of the one that parallels Christ's life. First, you make a parallel, a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
Except when we get to the last, very last, on the second page.
Mm-hmm.
If you could bring up the second page, we could see it, Christ's life being parallel metaphorically through. So we get to the bottom here. So the Father's empire, is that heaven? Is that God? Or is that the Father in a metaphorical sense being just a rich person wanting to kill a strong man? We're confused there. We don't know what to do with that.
Seeing this in this layout kind of confused me a little bit too. And one of the things I had always heard was the Son was Jesus in this. I heard that. And there's actually a totally different take that the fellows have on this verse that I was never taught. It's interesting. So I think you're going to like that too, because I was always taught this was Jesus was the Son. It's a very interesting passage. So in the first parable, we see that Jesus is telling a story of a woman that is demanding that her circumstance be rectified. Now, what's interesting about this piece of text is that first and foremost, what's not clear is if she was actually the victim in her circumstance for injustice. She wants a ruling in her favor, but we don't know what she wants the ruling for. We just see that she wants things to be done in her favor, and she's persistent. And I imagine that she is demanding justice. That makes sense. But ultimately, that's not clear what her motive is or what this trial is even about. I have no idea. Now, the other elements of this story that are also incredibly interesting are this. Here we don't see the judge as a would-be hero or a changed soul. He is indifferent to her and her circumstances and remains as such by the end of the parable. He doesn't change his characteristics at all. He does not have a change of heart. He does not have a spiritual awakening. None of that. He starts out a turd. He ends up a turd. He's a turd. He simply wants this person to leave him alone. Now, in the Koine Greek, the fellows point this out, that the language that the author elected to utilize within this narrative insinuates that this person's constant badgering about her case is metaphorically, this is what it means, beating his reputation black and blue. That's what the Koine Greek term means right there. That she is beating his reputation black and blue. So this again is a field guide for the progressive revolution right here, because persistence is key. And get this if you get nothing else. It's much more likely that we will achieve the goals of justice soon, possibly in our lifetime, if we are a thorn in the side of empire. Because the odds of us inspiring change or change of heart, for a lot of them, at least immediately, is slim and none. Heck, I didn't even change overnight. It took a long, long time for me to change. But because we pressure leaders to change, we have a better chance of seeing justice. Let me give you an example. Last year's government shutdown ended, and people were touting Democratic politicians as the reason that the shutdown was lifted. I remember this. All right, now I'm not telling you how to vote, but I am a Democrat. All right, I are one, and that narrative is totally untrue. All right, because union workers mobilized, and union workers were the unsung heroes of ending that shutdown because they stormed airport runways and shut down airports for hours. The news didn't cover it, but within hours of that protest of shutting down multiple airports, the shutdown ended. And that was totally responsible for unions. So can we give unions an amen? See, sometimes drastic measures are needed. Even if we're nonviolent, we still have a responsibility, biblically, to agitate. Yes. And agitation is far from unbiblical, even though it's uncomfortable to our ears sometimes. Now, this progressively gets worse. If this first story made you a little uncomfortable, just buckle up. Because the next story is incredibly interesting because the political subversion continues. Now, I had always assumed that this parable in the text, up until this week, was supposed to be Jesus predicting his own death. Jesus was the son in this narrative. But that view in the church, and the fellows pointed this out in a blog post, one of them had, that it's saturated unintentionally with anti-Semitism. And I've been teaching that for a long time. I didn't know, so I was guilty of this. And it's not the author's original intent, because the way that evangelicals have taught this, and the way I learned this, and I taught this as well erroneously, is that Jewish folks killed Christ. So in this interpretation, the way evangelicals teach it is that God sent his son to Jewish people and Jewish people killed him. Okay, now we all know that that's not true. Historically, we know that it was not Jewish folks that killed Christ, it was Rome. They were the responsible party. But luckily, the fellows with the Jesus Seminar cleared the air about this text and explained the likely original intent, which is this. The fellows have made it clear that the landowner and the son were to be seen as the villains in this story, not as the heroes, not as divine prophets. Tenant farming was an occupation that was saturated with abusing blue-collared workers and indentured servants and even slaves, as it was in America's past and even still is in our present, with Latinx folks working in America's farming industry, getting pennies on the dollar for back-breaking labor, as Bob pointed out in his wonderful poem. This parable is addressing that evil. In this story, the landowner is sending his slaves, which he was probably cruel to, but even if he didn't, we all know slavery is evil, right? So he sent his slaves to collect the profits of crops that he did not lift a finger to harvest from the land he was already profiting from when he leased it to poor folks, right? He is a thief. Yeah. This is as corrupt of a person as you can imagine being described here. Then after the landowner sees several innocent slaves beaten by these liberation farmers, rather than going to confront the farmers head on, he sends his own son to seek the claim. Now don't miss that. He cared more about getting paid than the welfare of his own child. Now, the fellows have rated this passage as authentic because its embrace of insurrection. And that's in line with the teachings of Jesus, though many of these same scholars are undecided about whether Jesus was a zealot or a nonviolent revolutionary. Now, I've always followed the line of nonviolence. That's where I land. But either way, no matter what Jesus intended, which we weren't there when this was written, no matter what the author intended, which we weren't there when he wrote it, make no mistake, the greedy oligarch is the villain here. Now, when I read that, and when I read it earlier this week, initially my heckles went up because of what I was taught about Jesus in the church. But let me also be clear, because I don't want anybody to be like too uncomfortable. I do not condone violent revolutions at all personally. I am all for embracing nonviolence. I think there are far more radical actions we can take that can more effectively build a grassroots movement than violence ever could. And you can disagree here in this church. You might be for violent revolutions. You can disagree. But even though I disagree with violence, we must be careful that we do not villainize the poor in this metaphor. Because just because they fought back in a way that we identify as uncivilized does not mean they had no reason to fight. For example, I have seen many videos, and this might make you, this might make you uncomfortable too, but we're already here, so let's enjoy it. I've seen many videos of people of color punching Nazis. Do I agree with punching Nazis? Do I agree with violence? No. Am I going to shed a tear about a white supremacist and a genocidal maniac getting his brain pan rattled? Also, no. But what if the Nazi was not acting violently? The existence of any Nazi is violence in itself. Their views of embracing genocide and racial supremacy already suggest a far worse crime than a punch ever could. And my point is this: even though I am nonviolent, we can disagree with violence without villainizing circumstances and ideologies that lead to an uprising. Even Dr. King said that a riot is the language of the unheard. He did not say go start a riot, but he certainly did not condemn the oppressed that justifiably felt the need to do so. Now, if the last story made you uncomfortable, if that was like, oh, this is cringy, buckle up, it gets even worse from here, y'all. It's an awesome progression, because the next story is straight up talking about an assassination, which I do not support political assassinations at all, Zuckerberg, or in case the CIA is listening to this conversation at all. I do not support violent revolutions. However, this is one of those times with theology that we get to talk about verses that don't necessarily comfortably fit within the confines of pacified religion. Now, last week we talked about how Martin Luther King and Jesus had been seen as arbiters of peace and love, so much so that their radical messages are often pushed to the side, or they're seen as heretical and evil when people don't know that they originated from Martin Luther King and Jesus. Now, again, I'm all for a revolutionary new way of life, but I think the revolution is never violent for me and always radical. But we must acknowledge that there is violence present in this passage, whether we like to see it or not. It's there. Even though I would not condone it. Even though you might not condone it. In this verse found in Thomas, this assassin finds a way to take out a corrupt ruler, like Game of Thrones style, by hiding in the shadows and stabbing the dude through a wall. Now, why would Jesus and or the early church use such brutality in their metaphors? Most revolutions during this point in Rome's history failed. But what you must remember with kings and rulers is that they were all genocidal tyrants. So these folks slaughtered anyone that questioned their authority in the most brutal way possible. And the reality of a fair trial was a foreign concept to them. If you were even thought to be affiliated with a revolution, you were killed, which of course fueled more violent insurrections. There's another story in the Gospels where Jesus instructed his disciples to sell their belongings and go buy a sword. And the disciples inform him that they have 2 swords already among them, and Jesus says, that's enough, or those are enough. Now ask yourself, how is this adequate for arming an uprising? How are 2 swords enough? you have at least 12 disciples. Jesus had more than 12, by the way, but you got at least 12. They're your closest students, and they're going to lead this uprising with 2 weapons. The math don't check out. Like, I'm from the Southeast, I went to public schools, but that don't work. The 2 swords were obviously not enough to take up a violent revolution with an army, but it was enough evidence to be accused of being a revolutionary. Remember how we talked about how Jesus possibly wanted to be seen as an insurrectionist so he could be executed and his death would galvanize and mobilize his followers to continue the grassroots movement to take down Rome? I wonder, and I can't prove it, if Jesus used these radical metaphors as well in his teachings to aid in the same purpose, to make it look like he was trying to start a violent revolution, which Rome did not put up with. Now that, of course, is purely speculative, but either way, the broader point that the author was attempting to get across to his audience with this metaphor was that the revolution is going to need to be smart. It's going to need to be well thought out. Because if you attack the beast of corrupt systems of governance head on, it will fail every time. But if you're clever, they will never see the revolution coming. And if we play it right, they won't even know that it was growing. Which is why I do not think that violent uprisings are a good idea in this modern age. Right? Because we can't win. They out-weapon us, they out-army us all the time. It's not going to work. But civil disobedience, protest, disrupting society, agitating, boycotts, those will get the job done all day, every day. And if we're willing to shed our own blood, if we're willing to sweat, if we're willing to shed those tears, I think we can see justice come much more efficiently than a violent revolution ever could. And I'm going to close our observation portion of the service with this. Embracing civil disobedience and public nonviolent agitation and unrest is paramount for progress. And it needs to be practiced during this time in this country by everyone in the church. And in this day and age, especially people with privilege. We have to be on the front lines. We have to be agitating. Because we can try to love these people into changing. And it might work sometimes, but it's not going to work immediately. And there are kids in cages today. And enough is enough. Amen? Amen. All right, so now we're going to talk about application. You're free to disagree with me during this portion too. So if you have other observations that you did not share with me, please share them with your table for a couple minutes, and we'll come back and share those with the group in just a moment. So what did y'all talk about? I heard some laughter. I heard some good conversation. Share. What we got?
I was just saying that it was crazy interesting how they always somehow make it into the core of the oppressed, into the bad guys that they can.
Mm-hmm.
And just, as a person of privilege, myself, being there for those people, like we were saying, people can't get out and protest because they have to go to work. They can't afford to not go. They'll get fired.
Mm-hmm.
So someone like me who has a little bit more leeway and privilege, I guess, get out there and be there for them, speak for them, so that something changes.
Yeah, we need to wield that privilege, y'all, especially us white folk. And there's a lot of us here, you know. Just saying. And I are one, so don't feel like I'm picking on you. Like I are one. One thing that I would appreciate too, you said this, in movies and in media, I think Bernie brought this up. It would be nice if the environmentalist would stop being the villain in movies. I don't know if you've noticed that trend.
Yeah.
That the villain is often like an environmentalist that is like, the world is gonna burn, and he always somehow ends up being this like genocidal maniac too. It would be nice if a conservationist was a villain, but the good guy for once. I've noticed that trend as well too. All right, so let's take a couple more. What'd you say?
She said, "Where's Captain Planet?"
Yeah, where's Captain Planet? Captain Planet was dope. Yeah, we need him. So I'll take one. Yeah, go ahead, Bernie.
I didn't discuss this with anyone because I was Googling to figure out where does this appear in the Gospels. You see that as it's dubbed, the parable of the wicked tenants, which of course is the traditional interpretation, is that this is God sending Jesus to be killed by the wicked tenants, and And it's in all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's early tradition, it's in Mark,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not part of Q.
Mm-hmm.
If I were to point to one verse to say that, Jesus was a violent zealot,
Mm-hmm.
this would probably be the one I pick.
Probably.
Because, it has that, flavor
Mm-hmm.
that violent insurrection is a tool that can and perhaps should be used.
Mm-hmm.
And Greg, how many here have ever seen The Last Temptation of Christ? You all remember that Judas is portrayed as a zealot, and he's always his task is to try to get Jesus off the side bench
Mm-hmm.
and get him into the revolution.
Yep.
And my first exposure to the scholarship of the New Testament was this idea that by S.G.F. Brandon, a now forgotten New Testament scholar, but prominent in the 60s and 70s, making the case that Jesus was a violent zealot, but he got pacified because that was the only way the religion could spread, and that it was that one of the strong communities of Christianity was in Rome, hence Paul's letter to the Romans, and it was ever very imperative for Jesus following groups in Rome to say, hey, our dude had nothing against Rome, and he was Mr. Peaceful. Love your enemies, turn the other cheek. And so that the original violent Jesus gets turned into peaceful Jesus, fairly early on in the tradition. And that's pretty. I never learned that, and for me it was Sabbath school.
Yeah, this was all new for me. This was all new for me too.
So anyway, we like that whole pacifism, but then we celebrate the American Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
That was the triumph of certain values
Mm-hmm.
via violence.
Mm-hmm.
And thank God for the French, because we never would have won without
Yeah.
and the Civil War. How did slavery end? A violent war with nearly 1 million casualties.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it took
Mm-hmm.
to stop slavery in the United States.
Mm-hmm. And when I first read this, and again, I fall in nonviolence, right? But one thing I started questioning about myself is, if this were hypothetically true, that Jesus was this violent zealot, why do I have such a problem with that, but I embrace folks like Luke Skywalker in movies as the heroes? Like, I look at them like, these guys are awesome, these rebels are clearly the heroes, but for some reason, Jesus couldn't have been that. And again, I tend to think he was a nonviolent revolutionary, but I kind of started questioning myself. Like, it's hypocritical in a way to read these stories and to uphold these narratives where the rebels against empire are the heroes, but somehow Jesus couldn't have been that. So I've noticed that as well. And this week, I couldn't help but think that these verses are incredibly relevant, no matter how uncomfortable they make us, right? The doomsday clock, I don't know if you missed this, has moved 2 minutes to midnight. And if something drastic does not change, this is not from me, this is from scientists. And hear me, church, for the love of God, hear me. Please start listening to scientists, please. If something does not drastically change, then we are looking at a future that threatens all life on earth, not just human life, all life, all right? Now, again, rabbit trail would be nice. I think one thing that would help is if we stop making the villains of movies environmentalists, but I digress. This reading was useful for this community and like-minded communities, and I believe even this nation, because we are so divided on the left. And I'm going to be honest, looking at the future of America, I don't think we currently have the capacity to create the kind of united front and momentum required to bring justice and equity in my lifetime or any generation following mine. I mean, I feel like we're in a bad situation right now. And if we're not careful, evangelicals will continue to poison this nation with their ideals and rhetoric, and we cannot let that happen anymore. It's what got us here, y'all. But we're letting it happen because institutions and corporate media are tearing especially the far left, apart. And we're taking the bait, myself included. We have to stop this divisive rhetoric on the far left. Because the only thing the media, Republicans, neoliberals, and folks in power hate more than Donald Trump is a progressive in leadership. And right now, honestly, that's the only thing that's going to save this country. So I think it's time that we on the far left come together and realize that we aren't the real enemy here. Corruption is, racism has always been, sexism as well, bigotry has been there too, warmongering, and capitalism definitely is. Matter of fact, it might be behind it all. Those are our collective enemies, but they will never be eliminated with unity alone. Right? This idea that we're all going to sing Kumbaya together. I'm just going to kind of sway things into being. All right? We have to be that itch that our nation's leaders can never scratch. Y'all, we have to cast away what is comfortable or pleasant in favor for what is just and what is right. And sometimes that means we must be a thorn. And to quote Pash Adams, we're a thorn and we're one that will never go away. So I have a request. Can we stop blaming progressives for Trump when they are the ones in the trenches fighting for change? I'm sick of Democrats blaming progressives for everything. And I know at times it seems like we progressives are intentionally instigating things, and there's a simple reason for that. We are. And I might be breaking progressive protocol, and y'all listen to this the whole way through. Please, please, please. Don't assume what I'm going to say. Give me the benefit of the doubt. I might be breaking progressive protocol here, but there is a methodology on the far left that is being utilized that is dividing Democrats and leftists. But this methodology is shockingly similar to the ethos of civil disobedience in today's first story. But it's also the reason for the myth about the majority of Bernie Sanders' base being Bernie or busters. And please know, I want you to vote your conscience. I'm not telling you to vote Bernie Sanders. But this is the reason why there's the myth of most Bernie Sanders supporters, or Bernie or busters. Don't misunderstand, gotta preface this. There are some Bernie bros that are toxic. I know that because they're a vocal minority. I've called them out. They need to be called out. If you're a toxic Bernie bro, stop it. But they're not the majority. However, everyone is terrified of a Bernie or bust at the polls because of dialogue they are seeing online, because some of Bernie's base, please give me the benefit of the doubt, they're threatening to do something that is going to be quite controversial. And I need to let you bunch of holy troublemakers in on a little secret. These folks are threatening to not vote for any Democrat if they get the nomination. Here's the secret. They don't mean it. They don't mean it. Now, before I explain, know that I am not advocating for this. I'm just trying to bring some unity on the left in a much needed time. Many protesters have been organizing and creating the perception that some will refuse to vote in 2020 if their progressive candidate is not elected. These online detractors admit in private, they've admitted to me that they do not mean it at all. They are doing it to create fear that some far leftists will not vote blue in the general if a progressive is not the candidate. They are trying to scare folks and strong-arm folks for a progressive choice. All right? Now, these same folks will ultimately tell you in private that it's a show. It's an act of nonviolent subversion. They don't mean it. Do I think it's a good strategic move? No. I think it's questionable. But my point is, and this is the important part, now that I got through all of that, they are using nonviolent subversion to force change. And whether we agree with it or not, loving loudly is biblical. Don't hear what I didn't say. I'm not telling you to go forth and do likewise. Don't hear that. But I am saying that those of us using more conventional means to incite change need to stop seeing radicals willing to do whatever it takes as the enemy. I'm sick of it. Back to my earlier lightsaber because it's too radical. Meaning, if we look at subversive tactics as the enemy today, then how can we claim to truly worship or at minimum even respect the subversion of Jesus in the early church found in the Bible? My message is not that we should ascribe to a specific methodology of protest. I would never tell you to do that, but rather we must accept that revolution is not a one-size-fits-all undertaking. And it is going to take the far left coming together and embracing civil reformists, uncivil agitators, and extreme abolitionists as equally necessary contributors for the greater good. And that's something the far left needs to do right now, in my opinion. The shoe may not fit you, it may not fit this church. It certainly doesn't fit for me. But we need many feet to both walk the path of progress and kick injustice in the poo hole once and for all. Amen? Amen. All right. And you may disagree with that, and that's still fine. It's still fine. I'm just seeing a lot of division right now. It's concerning. We're leaving our children with a mess of the world, and we have an opportunity to change that. But it's going to take a united front, and it's going to take many different approaches, some of which we're comfortable with, some of which we aren't. But my message for you is this: find where you fit in the revolution and work your ass off to end injustice. That's what I'm saying. And until next week, may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you wherever it may send you. May it guide you through the wasteland and protect you through the storm. May it bring you home rejoicing at the wonders that it shows you, and may it bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Grace and peace to you. See you at lunch.